Kia ora tātou, he karakia timatanga tēnei no nā whaia rangimārie Rose Pere, ai o ki te aorangi, aroha ki te aorangi, koa ki te aorangi, pono ki te aorangi, ai o ki te aorangi. Welcome to all and thanks for joining us this morning for our webinar with Dr. Juan Tauri, the challenges and opportunities for addressing inequities of the New Zealand justice system. We're wondering if the recent justice sector reforms and strategies have the potential to make significant changes to allow for a more just system in society. I'd like to acknowledge the community groups and NGOs from throughout Aotearoa, and also to those from government agencies who are looking for insight to inform your work. We acknowledge those who are joining us from other countries, including the US and Canada. Community research is committed to delivering quality training and development support through webinars, curating research and resources to support and promote the tangata whenua community and voluntary sector. Throughout the webinar, we invite you to join the Community Research Facebook page to post any questions for Juan. We'll answer your questions over the next couple of days. If you want to be notified when we're broadcasting our next webinar, please join our Facebook page and the Community Research discussion group. You can also subscribe to our monthly e-news by emailing communications@communityresearch.org.nz. Juan is a member of Ngāti Porou, iwi, and a senior lecturer in criminology at the University of Waikato. He's carried out a number of research projects on a diverse range of topics, including youth gangs, gendered violence, Indigenous experiences of prison and policing, and the globalisation of restorative justice. Juan's published widely and recently co-edited a special issue of the African Journal of Criminology and Justice Studies on Indigenous perspectives and counter-colonial criminology. He's published a book on Indigenous criminology, the first of its kind, with Professor Chris Cunneen from the University of Technology, Sydney. Many of you will be familiar with the work of Matua Moana Jackson and his seminal report, He Whai Painga Hau. It was a new perspective and a groundbreaking report published in 1988 that investigated the criminal justice system's bias against Māori, placing this within the broader context of the social, economic and cultural issues that have shaped New Zealand society. It was a landmark report that led to much public debate. There's recently about to be an update published, but since the 1988 report, little has improved. And in fact, some things have worsened in terms of New Zealand's disproportionate incarceration of Indigenous peoples. The rate of incarceration for Māori men has not changed in 30 years. They continue to comprise approximately 50% of the male prisoner population. The incarceration rate of Māori women has risen significantly, and today Māori women make up 64% of the female prisoner population in New Zealand. Juan's worked alongside Moana Jackson in this space, including helping organise the Māori Criminal Justice Colloquium, which was an Indigenous event to advance a Māori justice response. May I present Dr. Juan Tauri.
Okay, I'm up. Kia ora everyone. Just want to thank Kim and the organised Community Research for inviting me to speak to everyone today on the topic of, shorten the title, Addressing Inequities in the New Zealand Criminal Justice System. So by way of an opening statement, I just want to pose or offer the following as the central question with which my presentation is going to be concerned with or focused on, and that is the following. Is the criminal justice system in New Zealand what was a central platform of the colonial enterprise, or a colonial project, if you will, that was developed to support the colonial state, capable of delivering equitable justice for those disposed and criminalised by its actions over the last 150 or so years? I'll just repeat that. Is the criminal justice system in New Zealand, that which was a central platform of the colonial enterprise here, or a colonial project, if you will, capable of delivering equitable justice for those dispossessed and criminalised by its own actions? This is not the first time I think this question has been posed. Moana Jackson certainly did so in his 1988 report that Kim just spoke of, and I'm sure he will pose that question and attempt to answer it again in his soon-to-be released retrospective study 30 years after the original. I think it has been posed more recently as well in a number of other reports that are Māori-centred. The Otago School of Medicine 1918 report, and most recently by Just Speak in their 2020 report, A Just System for Everyone. While they may not have asked that specific question, it is one that when you read the results of the research, that they are asking a similar question at least: how can we rely on a system that has been part of the dispossession and criminalisation of Māori for such a long time to be able to correct itself and to provide more equitable outcomes for Māori in particular. So these, the Otago Medical School report, Just Speak report, these are just a few examples of what is fast becoming a much deeper lexicon that exposes the social harm that's been perpetrated against Māori by the state. If I'd been having this talk with you 10 or 15 years ago, I would have had very little empirical basis upon which to make the statements that I'm going to today. And there clearly, I think, has been a sea change within the academy and within the community-centred research, in which we are growing a much deeper, if you like, body of evidence to support the critique and criticisms that we have been making for 30 or 40 years in relation to the criminal justice system and its treatment of us. I say this so because to argue that New Zealand criminal justice system is inequitable and biased can no longer be dismissed as the subjective musings of the disaffected, as it is so often done by media, by the political class and the policy sector in New Zealand. That growing lexicon that I've just spoken of makes this claim that it is inequitable and biased an empirical reality. And I would argue that it has always been so. How could it not? For a start, the system itself was transported here as a key component of the colonial enterprise. Colonialism being the purposeful and systematic destruction of Indigenous life worlds and their replacement with one based on so-called Western Enlightenment principles and practices. Except, of course, that those so-called civilized principles did not apply to the original inhabitants of these islands or others, who were defined under the enlightened rubric of social Darwinism to be noble savages, with the emphasis on savages, and most especially when we resisted the colonial enterprise. So therefore, there is another empirical truism that we can associate with our relationship with crime control in New Zealand, one that is historically grounded in which continues to this day, and that is that the criminal justice was and is a colonial project, as that term is defined and theorised by Canadian scholars such as Wolford, Priol, and I use in my work. So what does this mean to be a criminal justice or crime control as a colonial project? In 2010, the preeminent Nigerian criminologist, Biko Egezino, forcefully argued that settler colonial criminal justice, and by that term he meant not just criminal justice, state-centred criminal justice, but criminology as a discipline, its parasitic partner, as he called it. He described the settler colonial criminal justice as a control freak, a white privilege dominated social control fanatic whose philosophical foundations were formulated and tested during the colonization of Africa, North America, and the Pacific. Engaging with and understanding the philosophical and epistemological history of settler colonial criminal justice is an absolute must, because as it provides a solid basis for understanding the sector's continued role in the subjugation and criminalisation of Indigenous peoples in all settler colonial contexts. For those of you who are not maybe aware of what I mean by settler colonial context, that includes the big four, as we call them: New Zealand, Australia, Canada, and the United States. Pretty much those places where the Brits turned up and then didn't have the sense to leave. That's my attempt at humour. I am in total agreement with Biko on this issue. Criminal justice, or given the absence of justness in the system, I prefer, I think the more accurate term, crime control system or social control system, has long considered us Indigenous peoples to be a problem populations in need of significant social management. social management through, for example, targeted surveillance, especially through racialized policing, geographical containment in the American and North American context in reservations or in residential schools to begin with, and later, including for Māori, via the prison industrial complex of late modernity. The prison having replaced, for example, in the American context, the slave plantation. In the Canadian context, for First Nations, in North America, replacing the residential or boarding schools. And thirdly, through correction, or offering us correction through a liberal dose of the so-called gift of Western knowledge, usually in the form of psychotherapeutic programs and other similar Eurocentrically derived interventions. So let us be frank, we have received, as Māori, a lot of attention of the type I've just mentioned since we began to flood into the urban context post-Second World War, and especially since the mid-1970s till today. And what has been the result of all this attention for us? Well, I think it's been a disaster. The continued criminalisation of Māori, the unnecessary use of violence by police, bias and sentencing and application of corrections, rules and procedures has, I argue, wreaked havoc upon our whānau. And please don't take what I just said to mean that I do not believe Māori never commit crime or are responsible for it, or that they don't harm their whānau, because of course we do. But my focus today is on the actions of the state, which I argue is a body also guilty of violence against us in the form of its policy making and its crime control procedures and interventions. And for those of you who think my claim of state violence against Māori is in any way exaggerated, then I advise that you read Professor Elizabeth Stanley from Victoria University's 2016 book, The Road to Hell, an expose of the violence perpetrated against a whole generation or two, in fact, of mostly Māori rangatahi by the state's youth justice and care protection sectors, thus creating a massive overrepresentation of our peoples in prison beginning in the early to mid-1980s. Much like Indigenous peoples residing in other settler colonial societies, we experience a number of what I call truths in our confrontation with the criminal justice system. One, that the system plays a significant role in bringing about and ensuring the continuation of our overrepresentation in it. We are the cannon fodder through which the system engine keeps running. Two, that the role of the system plays, especially the policy sector, goes largely unexamined and unchallenged. And I'll talk about how it goes about doing that and why in a moment. So, but I'm hoping today in this presentation to sort of confront the latter, especially, to open up the policy sector to the critique that I think is necessary if it is to actually finally make some meaningful change or advocate for meaningful change in relation to their discussions with their political masters. So now I want to then introduce, if you like, a second question, which will be the focus of the next part of my presentation, and that is, why are the Māori strategies, policies and interventions of the crime control sector in this country so ineffective, on the one hand, meaning making us safer, but on the other hand, extremely effective when it comes to criminalising and subjugating us? Why are these programs so largely irrelevant to the Māori communities they are supposedly designed to serve? So what is the crux of the problem here, and why I think the policy sector has failed for so long to engage with us meaningfully, but also secondly to create policies and interventions that work for us or are meaningful to us, is because it lives in a bubble. I call it the policy bubble. There are a number of issues and factors that play a role in the overall poor quality of Māori targeted policy intervention produced by the sector because of this thing that I call the bubble. So what is it? You have to just bear with me because I'm kind of testing these ideas out for the first time. It may not work, but hopefully it will make sense. Kim will tell me if it doesn't. So what is this bubble? Well, basically it's this thin veneer or membrane that surrounds the sector that is designed to protect it from external scrutiny and criticism. Yeah? And it is created through, for example, exaggerated claims of success that it makes continuously in the face of inevitable and catastrophic failure of its policies and interventions. This membrane is designed to insulate the sector from critical scrutiny. So how does the bubble manifest? Why do they create this thin veneer? And I think it's the particular fact that comes through, and for example, it results from a build-up of political pressure related to moral panic and political rhetoric relating to either a particular form of social harm, like, moral panics that we have sometimes around pedophilia, for example, and or pressure, political pressure that results from from a particular problem population like Māori or gangs, right? 2, it manifests because of the utilization of managerialist policy development tools, which are underpinned by core procedural, what I call procedural concepts, which are in actual fact meaningless rhetorical devices. So it's the language that they use to protect themselves. This is part of that protective membrane. So even though they know, I think that they know that much of their policy making and interventions are going to inevitably fail, they will protect themselves from scrutiny by arguing that their policy making is based on international best practice, right? Evidence-based policy, scientifically derived interventions, or what I like to call the veil of scientism. The academic criminologists often do this, particularly those of a more quantitative or psychological bent, right? Will strengthen themselves and try to protect themselves from criticism of their lack of engagement, for example, in Indigenous peoples, by continuously pointing to the scientific nature of their methodology. Right? So these are, as I said, rhetorical devices that the policy sector uses. So when you criticize them, they go, well, that intervention, multi-systemic therapy is based on international best practice. Best practice for white people in Wisconsin doesn't necessarily translate to good practice for Māori and Aotearoa. Yeah? 3rd, that insulates themselves and develops this membrane by, and don't get me wrong, a lot of the policy that is developed in the criminal justice sector is evidence-based. But my time in Te Puni Kōkiri of I don't know how many years, where Kim and I worked together as well, I saw the following time and time again. They would point and go, Juan, here's the references. And I would read them, and what they had done was cherry-picked and the empirical evidence that supports their preconceived, politically driven policy. Classic example in New Zealand, boot camps, okay, and ignoring the multitude of reports and research that demonstrated that this intervention does not work. Yeah, so yeah, their policy is informed by evidence, the one that suits their argument, while ignoring the massive amount of material that says the opposite. And this is the case, especially in the Māori policy sector, right? If you read their reports, it's as though that growing lexicon I talked about, that huge amount of knowledge that has been created by Indigenous communities, community-based research groups, and academics, just suddenly it doesn't exist, right? All this activity that they carry out to create the bubble, this thin veneer of protection, they do so knowing full well that the efficacy of their said policies and interventions will have little positive impact on Māori. And so one of my key criticisms of the policy sector in New Zealand is that the exaggeration of the success or effectiveness of their work is knowingly done and it is intentional. Right? It's knowingly done, it is intentional. I'll give you an example from my time in policy. When I was at TPK, some of you will remember in the mid 2005-06, there was a gang conflict in Wanganui where a young child was killed, conflict between the mob and Black Power. And of course, the you-know-what hit the fan. Media put pressure on Clark and the government at the time. What are you doing about this? And of course, the policy sector wasn't doing anything about this. They had no gang policy whatsoever. What they had on the books was the interdepartmental organised crime strategy. The organised crime strategy was not formulated to deal with ethnic or street gangs. It was to deal with international cartels. And so the Ministry of Justice were tasked with bringing a group, interagency group together, and they decided, we'll make amendments to changes to the organised crime strategy, which, by the way, by then was about 7 years overdue, to deal with the ethnic gang issue. And myself and my boss at the time, Harry Tam, and others pointed out that this was a retrofit. It did not fit. It did not fit, because the organised crime strategy was only interested in dealing with the issues of international drug cartels and what have you through surveillance and policing. Our argument was that that's not going to solve the so-called gang issue, which is as much a social development and social support issue as it is, or a public health issue even if you want, as it is a crime control issue. And that simply this would be an ineffective way of actually dealing with this. They knew that, but they didn't care because this was politically expedient. The policy sector needed to insulate itself not only from criticism from the media and the public, but particularly from their political masters for having sat around and done nothing, which is a bit unfair because the agencies had a rule, an unwritten rule, and still do, of not dealing with gangs, right? Not dealing with gangs because of the political fallout that would occur. Okay, and this has resulted in poorly formulated interventions and policy, because you cannot formulate good policy for Ngā Morehu or for other disaffected communities unless you engage with them. Anyway, so but in the end, the pressure becomes too much and the bubble bursts. And the catastrophic failure occurs because of a number of things. One, an over-reliance of our policy sector on importing external interventions that lack coherence to the New Zealand social context, and especially to Māori. Multi-systemic therapy is one that I spoke of before. When that was touted in New Zealand by a professor of psychology in the mid-2000s, when I was at a presentation he did, he was asked by Helen Leahy, who was an ex-boss of mine at the time, as to how this would work for Māori, and his response was, well, we've got evidence that it works for black people in America. And I pointed out that, well, we're kind of not black people living in America. There's a different context. Secondly, I think one of the reasons why their policy and intervention program fails catastrophically is because the acultural and atheoretical nature of policy making, meaning it's Eurocentric in its formulation. Thirdly, I would argue that this idea that the public service is the public service is wrong. It is first and foremost the political service. They are there to protect themselves, their budgets, and especially their political masters. What, when I was in government, we used to call the front page of the Evening Post test. How is this going to look? If it looks bad for our minister, even though it is necessary to enhance community outcomes and safety, we're not going to do it. Fourthly, I think that the catastrophic failure occurs because of a lack of skill and knowledge within the public sector, particularly the upper echelons, not at the, what I call the workers, of contemporary lived experiences and social context of Māori. In other words, they don't know how to talk to us or engage with us with respect. We are just seen as a problem population that needs containment. So what I'm saying is that these exaggerated claims that they make, they do so in the face of an inevitable catastrophic failure because of the political nature of policy making, and because policy making is, I argue, about control and manipulation of individuals and populations, and not in the first instance the reduction of social harm. I'm not saying that they aren't focused on that second point or outcome, but the first outcome is, as I said, protection of themselves and their political masters. I would also argue that the system contributes to the Māori problem in a number of, the Māori problem being our overrepresentation and also our critique, in a number of ways, including the ongoing utilisation of militaristic style policing strategies for brown people. The recent example is the armed defenders or the armed police units wandering around here in Hamilton where I live. Funny enough, in the areas where mostly brown people live and the mob live, even though in Hamilton, for example, and also in Aotearoa, by the way, which haven't seen any statistical significant rise in gun-related offending. Remember, that's actually the the principal reason or rationale the police have put forward for the trial, and also in South Auckland. But that's not backed up by their own data. And then when in Hamilton it's been reported to me that they're generally wandering around the places where we live. So you kind of, you wonder. Anyway, so anyway, we've got this ongoing utilisation of militaristic style policing strategies for us. As I said before, the policy industry's over-reliance on imported, contextually inadequate crime control interventions and consultation processes they carry out that marginalise Māori voices, knowledge and experience from the very act of policy making. As an aside, just something for everyone to think about, and it's something that I've asked time and time again with policy people, and they generally just look at me and stare. Have you ever wondered, those of you who work outside the policy sector, why they are so wedded to the importing crime control policies, mainly from other high crime societies like the US, Britain, and Australia? So I've got someone next door to banging on the wall, hammering. Why are they so wedded, why are they so, I think I'll talk about the reasons why later. I think one of the reasons is because what I call the policy cringe, that cultural cringe, we're not good enough. But anyway, isn't it counterintuitive that we tend to go to these other high crime societies and go, yeah, here's our really great intervention. I said, yeah, but your crime figures are pretty bad, right? Actually, I think it's, I think it's easy to understand, all right? It's easy to understand. I think I might have sorted out the reason that I've contemplated for a number of time. Because I think it's a reflection of what I call the just like us ethos I experienced when I was working in TPK. Meaning that the managerial class of the criminal justice sector are more comfortable engaging with those who look and sound like them, who speak the same language. See, they think these are people and this is knowledge that we can trust. And even better, if they think like them, then surely their interventions and policies that they have developed in Wisconsin are sound and therefore, justifiably justify our utilisation of them. So to my earlier point about, catastrophic failure of policy, a lot of the policy I found in my time and the public sector and since in doing independent research on it is that a lot of our crime control policy is pretty much head in the sand stuff. Okay, I'm going to the last part of my talk now that I've been brutalised the policy sector. And that is, I added this on last night. So again, let's see how this works. Because, and this is what I call solutions. Because Kim said that I had to include solutions. All right, and even though I don't necessarily see that as my job, others I think are more suited to that task. However, what Kim says she wants, you just do. Isn't it? Yeah. Kim, I can see Kim, she's like, yeah. I think, at face value, I think they're a decent set of solutions. By the way, I kind of started by thinking maybe I'll look at discrete policies, or discrete interventions. Let's bring, habilitation centres in instead of prisons and everything. All right. But I think there's been a number of reports, like the Just Speak report that just been released, and other recent research, the Otago University study by the medical school, what have you, have kind of, they'll give you the high-end solutions, systemic change, and then kind of discrete ones. I'll leave it to that. So I wanted to actually, I think, make mine much more what I call high-end or focus on systemic change. Because we're not going to significantly reduce Māori in prison and those of us being arrested and charged without systemic change. Little discrete policy, projects here and there, like, I don't know, the recent corrections interventions that they released in support of their new strategy. Okay, I'm not saying that they won't be, and some are having a positive impact, but of themselves, they're not going to significantly alter our very negative relationship with the criminal justice system. So I think I've got a decent set of solutions, right? But they are predicated on the system actually being serious about instigating even minor changes to its business, especially those coming from Māori, and that the political will exists to support fundamental change. And I'll talk about that at the very end. So here are my solutions, all right, at the high end. Firstly, we need to depoliticize crime control policy. The first strategy, this strategy or change appears on paper to be the easiest, but is in fact, I think, the most difficult to implement. We need to put a stop to the impact of political ideology and electioneering on our response to social harm. We need to depoliticize crime control policy in much the same way, for example, Finland did in the 90s. We need a cross-party agreement to stop this juvenile nonsense we suffer through every 3 years, where politicians of all stripes, or certain stripes, okay, and colours, try to out-macho each other about who can be seen to be the toughest on crime. And what is that? And this has been our political response to social harm for so long now. And what does it result in? Usually increases in policing, with the usual unrealised promises of a reduction in crime, more prison beds, longer sentences, and so forth. Like I said, this has been the standard response, political response to social harm for the best part of 3 decades. Has it made us safer? Or more accurately, do you feel safer? I asked this question, similar question in the talk I gave in Tauranga to a mainly Pākehā middle class audience, who went no. Elderly Pākehā audience. The answer is no. The way forward is to develop a policy process based on the needs of the community, and one less concerned with the needs of the politicians and their motivation to be re-elected. 2, so that's the first change, yeah? The second change, and this is directed at the policy sector that's perhaps listening in, hopefully. You need to get over the policy cringe, and you need to empower the community. Those who work with victims and offenders invariably know, in my opinion, what is needed to respond meaningfully to the social issues arising from social harm. We need the policy sector to work with them more directly and respectfully as partners to develop effective socially grounded solutions. And yes, I'm aware MOJ and others are now instigating this co-production, which is a shocking term, co-production. It's not co-production. You still hold the levers in terms of getting this policy signed off by cabinet and how much money, blah, blah, blah. So let's not kid ourselves, all right? It's just a different terminology for what has been a standard practice for so long, yeah? I'm talking about respectful, to develop a partnership to develop effective, socially grounded solutions. I've got that noise again. In order to do so, we need to move away from the policy cringe that too often afflicts the policy sector in Wellington. So much like cultural cringe, the policy cringe is based on the erroneous belief that things are done better elsewhere, outside this country. And that successful responses to social harm must be imported or should be imported from other jurisdictions, the ones I took, the high crime rate countries I spoke about earlier. So we import crime control policies from other jurisdictions, and invariably they do little to alter, they do little to alter them for New Zealand context, and then place them over the top, or instead of community-centered practice. And then we sit back and watch them crash and burn, as it happens so many times. The third change or solution I'm putting forward is which is the focus on treatment and social support, not criminalisation and imprisonment. I'm not advocating that we get rid of prisons entirely, although I am a prison abolitionist. That is simply unrealistic. But I think there's a simple solution or response that will reduce the prison population quickly and enable the Minister of Justice Little to meet his stated 30% objective in the reduction of prison beds by 2025 or whatever it is. Stop sending people to prison. Stop arresting people, charging them and sending them to court, sentencing them to imprisonment for victimless crimes like certain categories of drug offending. Stop sending people to prison who are addicted or mentally unwell, and increase significantly our reliance and focus on therapeutic jurisprudence and in-community habilitation and support. Sending people who are mentally unwell, and from what I've seen in the report just recently, they estimate that up to about 70% of our inmates that would have some diagnosable form of mental illness is only damaging the already mentally unwell. They're not going to get better. The prison is not a therapeutic environment. It is not a therapeutic environment. And here is a suggestion that will likely anger some, perhaps some of you listening in. We need to recognise the reality we are dealing with regarding our prison muster. As I said, some of them are addicted, they are mentally unwell, and many have long histories of trauma, domestic and sexual victimisation, particularly for our women in prison. We need to deal with their trauma first and foremost in order to stop them victimising others. While we put little of our corrections budget into trauma-related therapy and support, and treating them as criminals instead of people who have been traumatized, okay, they will continue to victimize both themselves, by the way, through self-harm and others. See, I say this knowing that alluding to the trauma that is suffered by offenders is unpopular for some people. But those of you who think that way are wrong. There are no, the offender victim is not a dichotomy. They're not separate groups. They are often one and the same, or both, right? I know this is unpopular, and it inevitably results in statements like, you're just making excuses for criminals. No, I am not, okay? I am, though, highlighting a reality that we need to deal with if we are to create a safer and more just society. By focusing on their trauma, the trauma experienced by offenders, I am offering an explanation for their behaviour. And we need to change the rhetoric there. By talking about the sexual abuse and the physical abuse that is suffered by a lot of our men who are in prison, is not excusing their behaviour, but is providing the context in which we need to treat them and support them so that they don't come out and do even more damage within the community. And until we grow up and get over this, you can't say supportive things about offenders. We're not going to significantly improve outcomes within this sector. All right? I'm not offering a reason to ignore the harm they cause others. I've got two more. How much time have I got? Am I okay here for time? Yeah, okay, thanks. Sorry, when I was just talking to Kim. The next solution, this is a very selfish one. It's all about me. And it's called Let Us In. The crime control sector in this country needs to grow up. It needs to stop being so risk adverse and allow independent researchers like myself and others to come in and undertake critical independent research on its business. My experience and that of a number of my Māori academic colleagues and other, community-based researchers is that too often the principal crime control agencies, and they've been doing this for some time, make it very difficult for independent critical researchers to scrutinise their performance. I'm talking about the strategy that the sector appears to be following the past few years of blocking critical research that does not suit their needs. It is blocking independent researchers from going about their business by using excuses like, for example, these are ones I've heard. The information that you wanted to gather doesn't match with our trending data, or with our strategic priorities or other similar such nonsense. And if that fails, corrections, of course, can always fall back on their well-worn excuse about the potential safety issues for both inmates and researchers, or muster issues, or whatever else they can think of. All right, which is interesting because the other crime control agents, sectors like, institutions and other jurisdictions that we compare ourselves to, like Great Britain, that seem to have no problem letting us in on a regular basis, right? The problem in the New Zealand context seems to grow from the intersection of what I think is a dangerous combination of three factors. One, we have a policy elite who appear to believe themselves above critique by the community. Two, we have a policy elite who believe that they're not answerable to the public. Okay, and they are supported by a political elite who share the same arrogance and aversion to independent scrutiny. Let me be even more frank, because Kim told me to be frank. Policy workers and government agencies, if you're listening in, you do not have all the answers. Okay, and I would say more importantly, because you are so close to your work, you often can't see the wood for the trees. In other words, it's sometimes very difficult to step back and critically analyze the impact of our own work, or to identify solutions that need to be, identify questions, that need to be asked and answered by research. Sometimes the questions and topics that the community, and I mean by that independent researchers like me, inmates, ex-inmates, inmates and ex-inmates, families, victims and service providers, believe are important, will not match with your priorities. but sometimes our questions are the right ones to be asking. So you remember, a government agency, including crime control sector, are part of the public service. It derives its resources from the public, purse. Therefore, I think it is time for policy practitioners to stop acting as though they are not answerable to the public, which includes the academy. My last point, solution, do something about the bias and racism within the sector. In answer to the oft-heard statement that we Māori should step up and take responsibility for the offending and victimisation that occurs in our own communities, I have this to say. Yes, we should, but we already are. From time to time, we hear this kind of comment from shock jocks and media, you know, what I call social entrepreneurs, you know, Mike Hoskins, is it Mark Richardson, whatever his name is, the ex-cricketer who somehow is now an expert in everything on TV3 in the mornings. You know, some shocking incident occurs, and invariably we have them asking, where are the Māori leaders? Why aren't they saying anything? Why aren't Māori doing anything? Okay, well, here's my ready answer to that. A, that's because you wanted to know where they are. Well, that's because they're out there doing the mahi. They're actually doing the work. And B, the shock jocks, the moral entrepreneurs, not the social entrepreneurs, sorry, are not exactly that important to us in terms of reporting what we are actually up to or doing. See, such commentators appear to me to never go out and find out for themselves what we're doing. For example, I've not heard once of one of these so-called experts going out to, say, Te Whakaruroho Māori Women's Refuge in Hamilton to look at their anti-violence or to experience the anti-violence work they do with Māori men in Waikeria prison. Or the numerous other Māori community-based entities who are working with youth and adult offenders and victims, often with far less government financial support per client than mainstream Pākehā-dominated providers. So such comments about us needing to do more are therefore uninformed and biased. Well, we do need to do more, but you know what? Here's the one way of allowing us. What I'm trying to say is, sorry, we're doing a lot. We need to do more. Yes, okay. So if you want us to do more, then here's what you need to do. Get out of our way. Stop putting policy and financial barriers in our way to developing more effective interventions for Māori. And while you're doing that, do something about the racism and bias that exists in both the frontline crime control agencies and also in the policy sector. The claim made by the police commissioner, the outgoing police commissioner, or I think he's gone actually, 2 years ago, that there is no racism in police, only that sometimes officers have this wonderful term, unconscious bias, is nothing more, in my view, than a political ruse designed to ignore the true extent and impact of racism within the force. That is predominantly directed against us and Pacifica peoples. The existence of racism and bias in police and other criminal justice institutions in other Western jurisdictions is well evidenced. Jurisdictions, by the way, that of course we regularly compare ourselves to. What makes the commissioner or the head of Ministry of Justice and his supporters believe that our system is any different? Right? Well, on one hand, because of that not letting us in I talked about, okay, we have not had the independent scrutiny of racism and bias within the system. They have actively blocked it. I've been blocked. When I was at Te Puni Kōkiri, we actually got cabinet sign-off on a meaningful research into bias and racism within the system. That the Ministry of Justice in cahoots with corrections blocked and turned into a lit review. Okay. So what makes them think, anyway, so what makes them think that we're any different? Well, perhaps it's because they continue to believe in this myth that New Zealand has the best race relations in the world, therefore bias doesn't exist in our system, and despite the best attempts to block independent research that I spoke of earlier, we actually do have empirical evidence that demonstrates bias. Starting with Jack Miner's report in '88, a couple of MRL attitudinal surveys in the '90s, Mike Roguski and Pani Tawhaiti's Police Perceptions of Māori Research published in 2000, and those most recent reports, okay, that I spoke of. If we Māori are to take up the challenge to do more, as we should, then just as importantly, I argue that the crime control institutions and policy sector in New Zealand need to be more open and honest about bias and racism that exist in their institutions, and they need to do something concrete about those issues. And if they do, perhaps then together we can change the landscape of criminal justice in this country, and Minister Little can meet his 30% target and make it sustainable over time. And now I'm going to end on a slightly negative note. That's all great, they're all my solutions. And remember I asked about, it's predicated on the political will. Well, right now, there isn't the political will. Well, excuse me, there is the political will within Labour and the Greens. But it certainly does not exist within the National Party and in New Zealand First. And there is the major barrier to systemic change right there. New Zealand First, for example, have already demonstrated that meaningful change is off the table. When they packed the sulk, when Labour attempted early on in their term to honour their election promise to repeal the 3 strikes legislation, right? And they will do so again if they manage to remain part of the government after the coming election. I, for one, was extremely surprised, but also pleased when Minister Little, a year or so ago, whenever, announced that he was going to put together a group of experts to travel around the country to look at finding out what's wrong with the system that he described as broken. In my lifetime as an academic and even within policy, I'd never heard a minister of the Crown describe an institution that way, and he's right. And then, I won't name names, but I actually attended one of their public forum, and one of the commissioners, one of the committee came up to me, and he said, and I said, this is amazing what you're doing, because I've never seen this before, driven by government. And he said, what do you think our chances are? And I said, none. And I said, because right now, NZ First will block any meaningful change. And they nodded and said, yeah, the political context is the one that we need to fix first. And how do we do that? By voting. So that's what I have to say, all right? Think about that, and I'll leave you with this point. Significant change to the system right now is effectively being held up by a party that obtained only about just a little over 6% of the vote in the last election. We fix that issue and we might actually get some meaningful change. Thank you.
Kia ora Juan, ngā mihi mahana ki a koe. We do have a few questions here from our attendees, and I'll just pose a couple of them to you and then move on to the next couple. So one is, do you have any comment to make about Māori focus units? And another, just to put in the back of your mind while you're responding to that, is how do you see, I guess, the health sector best supporting, I guess, best supporting change?
Oh, okay. What do I have anything to say about Māori focus units?
Yep.
Yeah, actually, while I'm saying that, I just saw there was another comment talking about, I can't remember Hokai, I can't remember what it is, I think it's the corrections, the new initiative.
Hokairangi.
Everything like that, saying, do you think they're not going to have an impact? They all have impact. They can have an impact for some individuals, all right? But what I said earlier was that discrete programs of themselves do not equate to significant or meaningful change. There needs to be, that's why I focused on these significant solutions, all right, or system-based changing. Because a lot of these discrete programs, if you look at the history of the last 30 years of the government's response to the Māori critique of its performance, has always been in 2 or 3 different areas. One is what we call, what's the term I'm looking for? Biculturalization, all right? They give themselves, suddenly all the prisons have Māori name, which really pisses me off, because it's like, you lock us up and now you want to take our language as well, and what have you. And these are, what's the word I'm looking for? They biculturalize their programs, so they get these blended therapeutic programs, which really aren't blended, they're psychotherapeutic, and they add a bit of Māori on the front and the end bit, And so these programs, like the one that was Māori Focus Unit and the new intervention, will undoubtedly have an impression and impact on some individuals. But those discrete programs of themselves are very limited in their resources, et cetera, yeah? And so we will not get meaningful change across the system and a significant reduction, right? One thing I will say about Māori focus units that people, I think, often don't realise is that Māori focus units and other Māori tikanga-based programs in the original design of the integrated offender management system under which corrections runs and still runs its programs and its processes and what have you for prisons, those programs were not included in the tranche of interventions that were seen to deal with criminogenic needs, the drivers of criminality. They were put in the responsivity tranche. They make us more amenable to psychotherapy. Does that make sense? So I remember years ago, and what's something that really annoyed me when I was at TPK, and it was actually almost when I think I got taken off corrections work by the then CEO, because they then put out a report in which they reported that there weren't any, that the Māori focus students and others weren't seeming to have a significant impact on recidivism. And my counter was, no, because you haven't designed or supported it to do so. It's like we don't consider dealing with cultural identity as significant because it's not a key driver of criminality. The criminogenic needs, for these who don't know, are things like drug and alcohol, anger management, and cognitive issues, not being able to think straight, yeah, make decisions. But the lack of engagement with your culture or cultural identity is not seen to be criminogenic. Therefore, the programs are not designed or expected to reduce offending. So with that in mind, Māori focus units and others were never supported or designed to have any great impact on reducing reoffending behaviour, even though it will do so for some. Okay, that's a long-winded answer. What can the health sector do? Well, the health, that's a hard question. I'm not quite sure what that means. But for example, if for some bizarre reason, Minister Little hears this talk and goes, yeah, okay, well, we'll open up a lot more habilitation centres and what have you and everything like that, then I'm sure the Ministry of Health will be able to play a significant role. Having said that, I will say this. I mean, I don't know, maybe different now, but 10 or 11 years ago when I was on the TPK rep on the driver of crime interagency group led by Ministry of Justice, the Ministry of Health officials time and again argued that they should have much more say and be able to do much more work within the prisons to deliver more responsive and appropriate healthcare to inmates in prison and post-release, and were not backed each time by the key justice agencies, justice and corrections. So my answer is, I think, and I'm guessing that the political will is still there in health, but until that, and again, the silo, and I didn't mention this as one of the solutions, but we need to get over this kind of siloed approach with government agencies. I mean, I sat through my career on 3 different interagency strategies to reduce Māori reoffending. I think there was Robin, reoffending by Māori, drivers of crime, and then I can't remember the other, effective interventions, right? You know, and they were a nightmare. The cabinet each time had directed agencies to work together to break down the barriers to develop more effective interventions, and all they did, especially the Ministry of Justice and Corrections, and in Ministry of Social Development, was patch protection the whole time. The police, and this was an agency that for a long time I didn't want to work with, were out of the crime control agencies, was the most open by far. And Ministry of Health and Education, that's simply trying to get, some way of having a more effective, playing a more effective part in the system, which is simply blocked all the time because it was seen by the core crime control agencies as them having to give over some of their bloody will too.
There's a couple of other kind of comments there, interrelated, I guess, but also standing on their own. One is about somebody noted there that prisons are being referred to as iwi housing at the moment, and often former inmates are finding it really difficult to access housing on release.
Oh, yeah. And
the other kind of side to it is really links back to some of the kōrero you had about criminogenic kind of assessment. And there's a concern by one of our attendees around the bias, I guess, in terms of some of the AI or how the data is quantitatively being assessed in terms of, I guess, things like recidivism or risk.
Okay, that's two big questions.
They
You're
are
going to have to repeat the first one because I lost the track of that up to that second one, which is quite complex. Can you repeat the first one to me again? Sorry.
So the first one is the first one is actually about concrete help for prisoners on release and the housing shortage being a huge issue for people wanting bail and support post-release.
Yeah, if I was going to talk about, solutions, in terms of programs and what have you, then certainly if I had chosen to go that way instead of where I went in that part of my presentation, I would definitely say that we've got to do something about a reintegration strategy as it's currently implemented within corrections, or whatever the new name they've given it, because they probably changed it again. In my time in government, it's shocked me to see that the meaningful support that had been provided by external agencies to inmates as they were ready to leave was systematically, to my mind, peeled back. Yeah. And so we have a situation, and it still occurs today in certain areas like this one, where people are released, the guys are released or women are released, driven in a van out to the work and income office, and then go, there you go. And they turn up with no ID, you got no ID, you don't get no benefit, and you can't get the interim, whatever money it is and all that there. You can't get any assistance for housing, etc., etc. Yeah. Mm. And in a situation like that, what do you think happens to a lot of these people? Right? They'll either sleep rough or they'll go hungry, and and hunger has a particular impact on us, and they're going to commit a crime, blah, 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 and they end up back inside. And so this is one of the major failings of our system, is what we call through care. Some great strategies there, but I don't see any meaningful support given to ensuring that when they get out, they have the social support and they have that they require, including housing. So this brings it, and I probably should have said this at the end when I talked about we can change the system in some ways by voting strategically, right? We need, and probably this is a major weakness of my presentation. What I need to say is that the change must start with us. We also need to change our attitude to offenders. This does actually relate to the point I made about before when I talked about needing to deal meaningfully with the trauma of our inmates. And a lot of people don't like that because it's seen as excuse. We need to change our mindset within the system. Okay, because we are an extremely punitive people. We don't like to think it, but we are. We love punishing. We love prison. We have the second highest prison rate of all Western jurisdictions. We're only second to the United States. So this idea that we're some sort of egalitarian bloody this mythology of egalitarian bloody country and what have you is a lie. It's a lie. And so we need to significantly change that mindset. Why? Because can you imagine if one of the and the initial reports that come out of that group that Minister Little put together was around things like health care, through care into continuation of addiction-related therapy for inmates and social housing and everything. The outcry, because what's going to happen? National and the others are going to turn around and go, prioritising the need of offenders. Well, it depends on what are our priorities. Because if we don't support them adequately to get into meaningful employment, to continue the therapy they need to deal with their addictions and mental health issues, to give them a roof over their head, they're going to continue to violate others. So we need to change the mindset within the New Zealand population in general towards offenders and victims. The second question around data and everything like that, I don't know how to answer that question. It's far too complex for me. I'm sorry. Yeah.
We've got another couple of quick questions. One, there's been a suggestion, there's quite a few questions around dismantling the policy elite, and in particular Mayfair House, which I understand is corrections head office.
Yeah. I think that was Adrian Tapati, wasn't it? Adrian
I don't know, don't give him shout outs, you'll just encourage him. The other question is really around what about the establishment of a Justice Ombudsman? And do you think that might be a useful tool for really monitoring the system and challenging it?
Yeah, I think so. Although, similar to the Independent Complaints Authority, Yeah, I absolutely, I think that Justice Ombudsman is absolutely necessary, and with the power to do some real damage against these institutions while they brutalise us, you know. And one of the course, you know, I don't know if everyone knows, there's a project here, I think, that is actually government-centred, but housed here at the University of Waikato, which is around almost independent scrutiny for, what do you call it, incidents of injustice within the system itself, wrongful convictions and all that kind of thing. So we're stepping, and that's a huge move, I think, and signifies, at least within Labour and the Greens as part of that particular coalition, that they are interested in meaningful change. Right? It seems like a small step to everyone, but it's not. And a Justice Ombudsman absolutely would be, I think, the next step as well. As for the question about what do we do about the policy elite, you know, again, the pressure has to come from us, from the community and from researchers. And I get criticised a lot for being a stone thrower, you know. I get all the time, when you get in the tent and make meaningful change. Well, as Kim will tell you, I don't have the personality to work within the tent. All right, and I don't see it being a stone thrower as sitting outside. Oh, it's easy to sit outside the tent. No, it ain't. The vitriol that you get and the personalisation of critique and the barriers and blockages continuously thrown at me and people like me, I don't care really. You know, I can kind of work around them. But I think the role of external critic, particularly from the Māori perspective, is absolutely important. There are Māori who do work in the system. We have some of our colleagues, ex-colleagues at TPK and others who do wonderful work. I don't know how they do it, because I know I used to go drinking with them on a Friday and I'd sit there and go, my God, you know, the stress of continuously having to massage the bloody fragile egos of the policy elite within Mayfair House and Ministry of Justice. And I couldn't deal with it.
We need to wind this up. Sorry, people have blocked this in from 11 till 12, but Juan will be available on Facebook Community Research Discussion Group to answer some of the remaining questions, and we'll post those up there. Sorry, Juan, to cut you off there. I'd like to thank you for your insights and challenges to the system and our role in particular in making change. There are many ways that you highlighted to take action, joining with the work of groups such as Just Speak, who advocate for change, reading Inaia Tuanune, the Māori advisory group Justice Sector Report, supporting Pillars, who support the children of prisoners.
That's right. Supporting
employment and development opportunities for those who have been incarcerated or in trouble with the system, learning more about restorative justice, and I know we've got a question about the Navajo Peacemaking Project, so we'll post that on Facebook, and have discussions with your colleagues and friends that can highlight the need for a justice system that can create real transformative change for those whose lives are significantly impacted by the system, both directly and indirectly. Kia ora rā, he mihi mahana ki a koutou katoa.
The Community Research website offers a hub for good community research and researchers. It's the place for the public to find and share evidence about effective community practices. The website collects research and evidence and organises these so that they can be easily accessed and used by other groups. You can access this research and browse by category, by a list of quick-link topics, or by searching for something specific. All of the research is free to download. The Community Research site is all about excellence and effective practices. You can view recordings of past webinars and find out about future ones. The webinars share evidence about what's working in the community sector. Published by Community Research in 2007, the Code of Practice provides the standards and guidelines for doing research. It's the place to start if you're thinking of undertaking research with or in a community or iwi. As well as the collection of research, we keep a register of experienced researchers who are skilled at working with iwi and communities. To find a researcher who can help you, we have a filter system which allows you to find people based on location, qualification, ethnic group, and area of expertise. The Community Research website is a unique resource for the community sector to use and share. It matters because communities who learn well will do well. It matters because it evidences what's working for us. For researchers and community people alike, we've made it as easy as possible to share your research on our website. Kaua e whakamā. Uploading material is quick and simple. Save your work as a PDF and head over to Share Research. Answer a few questions that help us tag and organise the research so it's easy for people to find. If you're a researcher and skilled at working with communities, you can add your details to the directory of researchers so that you can be found. Community research keeps you updated and informed. This helps make you more effective. If you want to stay updated about the latest research, informed about new resources and our upcoming webinars, head over to sign up for our e-news on the homepage. Community research is a rich resource built for and by the community. For it to reach maximum potential, we rely on you to contribute, participate, and support the resource to grow and thrive. Mā te kotahitanga e ora ai tātou.